Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're going on a really fascinating 10-minute journey through the criminologist's lens, and our main goal? To separate myth from reality. We're going to step away from all those sensationalized true crime stories that completely dominate our news and social media feeds, and instead, we're zeroing in on the evidence-based realities of crime and prevention. Over the next few minutes, we'll unpack the key concepts from some highly revealing data so we can actually understand what's really happening on our streets and in our homes.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our map for today. Number 1, beyond the crime headlines. 2, the intimate nature of violence. 3, robbery, the dangerous bridge. 4, property crime, the quiet majority. And 5, solving the puzzle, prevention.
Section 1, beyond the crime headlines, uncovering the data behind the fear.
Now, it is completely understandable to fear violent crime, right? Its harms are direct, they're irreversible, and let's be honest, it commands the lion's share of our daily news feeds. But what's really interesting about this is when you actually look at the Bureau of Justice Statistics data. See that massive section? That is property crime. The tiny little slice, that represents violent crime. You see, the public consciousness massively inflates violence because of its severity, but the statistical reality is that property crime is overwhelmingly the quiet majority. We kind of have to hold both truths in our heads at once here. Violence is relatively rare, but it matters enormously.
And when that violence does occur, it's definitely not just randomly distributed. Violence is actually highly concentrated. There's something called social disorganization theory, and it basically explains that violence clusters in very specific disadvantaged urban areas, often among a really small network of high-risk individuals. Plus, both offending and victimization peak in late adolescence and young adulthood. Criminologists call this the age crime curve, before it steadily declines as people get older. So violence isn't random, it is heavily patterned.
And, those patterns, they change over time. Just take a look at the historical timeline of what's known as the crime drop. Violent crime rose pretty steadily through the 1970s and actually peaked right around the early 1990s. But then, we saw decades of dramatic, almost unprecedented decline, right up through the 2010s. Now sure, we saw some notable fluctuations around 2020, but understanding this timeline proves that crime rates are incredibly dynamic. They respond to this complex mix of economic shifts, demographics, and systemic factors.
Section 2, the intimate nature of violence. Breaking the stranger danger myth.
So, to truly grasp violent offenses, we have to recognize some pretty difficult realities that challenge basically everything television has taught us. While the media loves focusing on serial killers or random stranger attacks, statistically speaking, those are incredibly rare. So the crucial point is that most homicides are actually expressive, meaning they're driven by raw emotion, anger, or an escalating conflict between people who already know each other, like acquaintances, partners, or family members. This is entirely different from instrumental homicide, which is goal-oriented, like, say, killing someone specifically to get cash during a bank robbery.
Because most violence is expressive, it very often follows a terrifyingly simple pattern of escalation. It usually just starts with a minor dispute, but then the introduction of a firearm drastically changes the entire equation. And finally, it spirals into an aggravated assault or a homicide. Honestly, quite often, the only difference between an assault and a homicide is literally a matter of inches, split seconds, the lethality of the weapon used, or just how fast emergency trauma care can arrive on the scene.
Which brings us to a massively critical concept in criminology, the dark figure of crime. This term refers to the vast amount of crime that goes entirely unreported to the police. According to CDC data, sexual violence and intimate partner violence are enormous, systemic issues that remain largely hidden precisely because of this severe underreporting. And the offender? It's almost always someone the victim knows, completely destroying that classic myth of the random stranger in the alley.
To understand exactly why these crimes stay so hidden, we really have to look at coercive control. This involves intense dynamics of power, fear, isolation, and financial dependence. When we view intimate partner violence through this specific lens, it forces us to totally reframe our thinking. Asking that judgmental question of, well, why didn't they just leave, is absolutely the wrong approach. We have to instead understand the incredibly complex cycle of violence that literally traps victims.
Section 3, robbery, the dangerous bridge where violent force meets property motives.
Now, shifting gears a bit, robbery uniquely sits right on the border between violent crime and property crime. And to get it, we need to understand the robber's mindset, which is governed by something called bounded rationality. Now, robbers do reason about their targets, right? They look for people who are isolated or who look like they have cash on them. However, this rationality is bounded or severely limited by high-pressure circumstances. Their decision-making gets heavily warped by immediate financial need, peer pressure, or substances, which basically causes them to completely discount the long-term risks of what they're about to do.
And because of that intense, high-pressure environment, robberies can escalate so fast. An unplanned killing very often happens simply when a robbery situation spirals out of control. This is exactly why robbery is always treated as a severe, violent crime by the justice system, even if the offender's primary motive was literally just to snatch a wallet. The potential for grave, deadly harm is inherently built right into the act itself.
Section 4. Property crime. Quiet majority. The everyday convergence of opportunity.
Okay, so these next crimes are the ones that actually drive most of our everyday decisions, like whether to install a home alarm or worrying about where we park our car at night. Routine activities theory breaks down exactly how this works. And this brilliantly illustrates that for a property crime, like larceny, a burglary, or vehicle theft to happen, you need the everyday convergence of three very specific elements: a motivated offender, a suitable target, and a lack of guardianship. If you manage to remove just one of those columns, say by adding guardianship like a simple steering column lock or just having an alert neighbor, the opportunity vanishes and the crime doesn't happen.
We all kind of have this movie image in our heads of the persistent professional, right? The highly skilled cat burglar who treats crime like a dedicated trade and uses underground networks to move stolen goods. But in reality, the vast majority of property offenders are just occasional offenders. These are amateurs. They are opportunistic and sporadic, basically just seizing easy, immediate targets whenever that routine activities matrix we just talked about aligns perfectly for them.
But we have to acknowledge the landscape of property crime is changing at lightning speed. Fraud is absolutely exploding online. Crime inherently follows value, so as our money and our daily commerce moved over to the internet, well, theft did too. Identity theft and online scams are really blurring the lines of traditional property crime, and much like intimate partner violence, online fraud remains heavily uncounted. Victims very often feel a lot of shame, and honestly, the incredibly complicated jurisdictional issues make it a nightmare of a crime to track and actually prosecute. Section 5. Solving the puzzle. Prevention. Multi-level strategies that actually work. Let's move to and see how this builds from diagnosing the problem to exploring the multi-layered solutions.
So, having diagnosed the root causes and the triggers of crime, we can finally explore the solutions that actually get results. The most effective, evidence-based crime prevention doesn't rely on some single mythical magic bullet. Instead, it's all about the rule of three. There are 3 tiers of prevention that really must operate simultaneously if we want to achieve lasting safety in our communities.
Tier 1 focuses purely on situational prevention. This is all about changing the immediate physical environment to just ruthlessly cut off opportunities. So we're talking about target hardening, like putting immobilizers in vehicles, improving surveillance and street lighting, removing rewards by keeping way less cash on hand, and utilizing highly focused hotspot policing. By making the effort and the risk way too high, you drastically reduce both property and violent crimes right at the source.
Now, a really common concern I hear all the time is, well, doesn't this just push the crime down the street? Actually, no. This insight from the National Institute of Justice perfectly busts that myth of crime displacement. To quote them directly, crime does not simply move elsewhere when a hotspot is addressed. Well-designed efforts often produce a real net reduction. When we eliminate the specific opportunity at a concentrated hotspot, we very often eliminate the crime entirely rather than just, shuffling it around the neighborhood.
But here's the thing. Situational tools simply can't fix the deep root causes. That is exactly where tiers 2 and 3 come in: community and societal prevention. This means building collective efficacy in our neighborhoods, stabilizing housing, and using targeted violence interruption for those very small, high-risk networks we mentioned earlier. At the broader societal level, it requires deep upstream investments. We're talking quality education, true economic inclusion, and reducing developmental risks, like childhood lead exposure. This approach replaces broad, indiscriminate crackdowns with highly targeted structural support.
Which brings us to our final and perhaps most provocative question today. Are we actually willing to invest in the multi-level community solutions that we know prevent crime? Or are we just going to keep reacting to the sensational headlines? Today we've looked through the criminologist's lens to see the hard data, the opportunity structures, and the very real, very complex human elements of crime. The evidence clearly shows us what works: a blended, data-driven approach. Now it's really up to us to look past the news alerts and advocate for those real solutions. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this gives you a completely new perspective the very next time you see a crime headline pop up on your feed. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.